The tray slipped from his trembling hands the moment he saw him. Seo Hyun-woo, neck tattoo, black suit, the kind of silence that walks in before the man does, standing inside a restaurant he had no business being in. And when his eyes dropped to Ji-hoon's swollen belly, 8 months heavy with everything they were never allowed to say, every person in that room stopped breathing. Ji-hoon's world had shrunk to the size of a restaurant apron. Sticky tables. A spine that screamed by the third hour of every shift. Feet so swollen his shoes no longer closed all the way. He moved through each night on precision and discipline. Scent blocker reapplied every 4 hours without fail. The apron strings tied loose enough to disguise what 8 months had made impossible to disguise, the practiced habit of turning his back whenever a black car slowed outside the window. He had traded designer silence for this dim, fluorescent survival. And he had told himself every single night that it was worth it. Seo Hyun-woo had told himself something different. That the Omega was gone by choice. That the bond would fade. That a man who controlled Seoul's most feared criminal network could simply decide to stop feeling the cold burn of an unanswered bond mark. His second-in-command watched him dismantle 3 rival clans in 8 months and said nothing. His father called it focus. Only Hyun-woo knew what it actually was. A man tearing the city apart one room at a time, looking for a scent he could no longer find. He walked into that restaurant for reasons he could not name. And the moment Ji-hoon turned around, the tray hit the floor, and 8 months of engineered silence collapsed between them like it had never existed at all. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The alarm on Ji-hoon's phone never actually woke him. He was always already awake, lying on the narrow mattress in the restaurant stockroom, one hand flat against the curve of his belly, listening to the city outside pretend it was still the middle of the night. The baby would kick somewhere around 2 in the morning, a firm, insistent pressure just beneath his ribs. And that was that. Sleep was finished. Another day had begun. He would lie there for a few minutes in the dark, cataloging his body the way a mechanic checks an engine before a long drive. Back, tight, pulling on the left side. Feet, already beginning to throb before he had even stood up. The bond mark on the left side of his neck, a dull, hollow ache, like a tooth that had been pulled and left the socket empty. That one never changed. That one he had stopped expecting to improve. By 4:30 he was up, moving quietly between the stacked boxes of dried goods and industrial cleaning supplies that shared the stockroom with his mattress, his single bag of clothes, and the small cardboard box where he kept the things he refused to throw away. He applied the scent blocker the way other people took vitamins, without thinking about it, without looking at himself in the cracked mirror above the utility sink. 2 pumps on the throat, 1 on each wrist. Wait 30 seconds. Done. The restaurant did not open until 11, but the prep work started at 5, and Ji-hoon had learned early that arriving in the kitchen before the head cook meant a warm bowl of leftover broth and no questions about where he slept. Mr. Beck, who owned the restaurant and had the energy of a man who had long ago run out of opinions about other people's lives, had offered him the stockroom without ceremony 3 months ago. "You are clean, you are quiet, you are not trouble," the old man had said, sliding a spare key across the counter. "Don't make me regret it." Ji-hoon had not made him regret it. He worked the lunch rush and the dinner service back to back, moving between tables with a care that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with the life inside him. He kept the apron tied above the belly. He kept his collar up. He kept his eyes on the floor when men in expensive suits walked in, because expensive suits in this part of Seoul meant connections, and connections meant the wrong person recognizing a face that was supposed to be gone. By 9 in the evening his feet were past the point of complaint. They had entered a kind of numb acceptance, a truce between his body and the shift that would not end. He wiped down the last table in his section, stacked the chairs, and counted his tips twice in the kitchen doorway. A habit that had nothing to do with distrust and everything to do with the fact that he needed to know precisely what he had. Precision was the only luxury he could still afford. "You should sit," said Mina, one of the other waitstaff, nodding at his feet with the blunt concern of someone who had been saying the same thing for 6 weeks and expected it to work eventually. "I will," Ji-hoon said. "He always said that. You said that yesterday. I mean it more today." She clicked her tongue and disappeared into the back. Ji-hoon folded his tips into his pocket and stood very still for a moment, one hand on the edge of the counter, letting the restaurant settle around him into its end-of-night quiet. The baby shifted. He pressed his palm flat against his side and waited until the movement stilled. "I know," he said quietly to no one, to the only person who was always there. Almost done. He had not spoken to anyone from his previous life in 8 months. Not because he hadn't thought about it, but because the last conversation from that life had been so complete, so carefully final, that there had seemed nothing left to add. It had been a Tuesday. He remembered that specifically, a Tuesday in July, still light outside at 7 in the evening, the kind of summer evening that made Seoul look like it was made of gold. He had been waiting in the lobby of Hyunwoo's private tower, because Min Jae, Hyunwoo's head lieutenant, had called and asked him to come. Said the boss wanted to talk. Said it was important. Min Jae had met him in the lobby instead of sending him up. That had been the first thing. The man had been immaculate as always. Dark suit, no expression, a manila envelope held at his side with the casualness of someone delivering lunch. He had not offered Ji-hoon a seat. He had placed the envelope on the security desk between them and said, with the practiced neutrality of someone reading a weather report, "The boss asked me to handle this personally." He felt it would be easier this way. Ji-hoon had opened the envelope with steady hands. He had always had steady hands. It was one of the things people said about him, that he was calm, that he was gentle, that he never made anything difficult. Inside were severance bond papers. Signed. Hyunwoo's seal at the bottom, precise and unambiguous. Dissolution of secondary bond. Effective immediately. And beneath it, a single printed page. A property transfer, a bank account number, a sum of money that was meant to feel like consideration. He has chosen a more suitable arrangement, Min Jae had said. Someone from an alpha-lined family. The bond with you was informal. This resolves it cleanly. Ji-hoon had stood very still. Outside, through the tower's glass walls, Seoul had continued to look like it was made of gold. He couldn't tell me himself, Ji-hoon had said. Not a question. He felt this was kinder. Ji-hoon had put the papers back in the envelope. He had picked up the envelope. He had walked out of the lobby and into the gold evening, and kept walking until the tower was no longer visible, and his legs were no longer steady, and he sat down on a bench near the river and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives when something is completely over, that he was alone. He had not known yet about the baby. He had found out 3 weeks later, in a pharmacy bathroom, holding a test with hands that were, for the first and only time, not steady at all. He had not gone back. In the stockroom, much later, the baby kicked again. Ji-hoon lay on his side on the narrow mattress, the city outside finally quiet, one hand curved around the movement beneath his ribs. The bond mark on his neck ached the way it always did, steady, hollow, patient, like something that had learned to wait without understanding what it was waiting for. "It's okay," he said softly in the dark. "We're okay." He said it until he almost believed it. Then he closed his eyes and waited for morning. There was a version of Seo Hyunwoo that Seoul knew and feared. The version that sat at the head of a conference table and made decisions that rearranged the city's power structure before the coffee went cold. The version that walked into a room and changed its temperature. The version that had built the Seo network from his father's aging empire into something modern and surgical and untouchable, and had done it before he turned 32. That version still showed up. It dressed correctly, spoke precisely, and signed everything that needed signing. It had not missed a single meeting in 8 months. Park Dae-young, who had served as Hyunwoo's second-in-command for 6 years and knew the difference between the man and the performance, watched both versions with the quiet attention of someone waiting for a structure to show its crack. The crack was always the bond mark. Hyunwoo never touched it in public. He was too controlled for that. But Dae-young had noticed, sometime in the second month, that the boss had stopped wearing shirts with open collars. Had started sitting with his left shoulder slightly angled away from the room. Small adjustments. The kind a man makes when something hurts in a place he refuses to acknowledge. The Lee Ji-hoon trail went cold again. Dae-young had reported one morning in October, sliding a folder across the desk with the careful neutrality he had learned to use for anything involving that name. Last confirmed location was a Jimjilbang in Mapo, paid cash mid-August. Nothing after that. Hyunwoo had not looked up from the document he was reading. Expand the radius. Private contacts only. No official channels. We've expanded 3 times. Then expand again. Dae-young had picked up the folder. Can I ask what we're telling the men? In terms of the reason for the search. Hyunwoo had looked up then. The look was not threatening, it was worse than that. It was exhausted, in the way that only becomes visible for a single unguarded second before the mask returns. Tell them whatever keeps them looking, he said. And that had been the end of the conversation. The months had accumulated like unpaid debts. Hyunwoo dismantled the Kwan operation in November. Efficiently, completely, with a coldness that even his father had noted approvingly. He restructured 2 subsidiary networks in December and attended every required family dinner with the correct expression on his face. In January, he had sat across from a woman named Yoon Soo-yeon, daughter of an allied clan, while their fathers discussed terms, and had been so perfectly, glacially polite that Soo-yeon herself had leaned toward her father afterward and said quietly that she was not interested in marrying a ghost. Dae-young had heard about that secondhand and had not repeated it to Hyun-woo. What he did repeat in February was that Min Jae, the lieutenant who had handled the Ji-hoon severance, who had delivered the papers, who had been the last person to see Ji-hoon before he disappeared, had requested a quiet internal transfer to the Busan operation. Dae-young had flagged it as unusual. Hyun-woo had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, and then said, "Deny the transfer. Bring him to me." What happened in that meeting, Dae-young did not know entirely. He knew that Min Jae had gone in composed and come out the color of old paper. He knew that Hyun-woo had emerged 40 minutes later and said, with absolute quiet, "The severance bond papers were not authorized by me. Find out who else knew." Dae-young had found out. The information had taken 3 weeks and rearranged everything he thought he understood about the last 8 months. He had placed the full report on Hyun-woo's desk on a Wednesday morning and stood back and watched the boss read it without moving, without expression, without making a single sound, for 11 minutes. Then Hyun-woo had closed the folder and said, "Find him. Not find the situation. Not resolve the matter. Find him. We're still looking," Dae-young had said carefully. "The trail is 8 months cold. Then we follow something warmer." Hyun-woo had stood, and there was something different in the way he did it. A directness, a forward momentum that the previous months had been missing. He needs money. He needs food. He is not the kind of person who asks for help. Where does a person like that go? Dae-young had thought about it. Somewhere cash only. Somewhere that doesn't ask questions. Restaurants. Night markets. Service work. Hyun-woo had already reached for his jacket. Start with Mapo. Work outward. That had been 2 weeks ago. They had worked outward methodically, Hyun-woo reviewing locations personally in the evenings, after the day's official business was concluded. Not frantic. Not visible. The kind of search that looked, from the outside, like a man taking late dinners alone. On the night it ended, Hyun-woo had not been thinking about Ji-hoon specifically. That was the thing Dae-young would turn over later, trying to understand it. They had been working through a list of small restaurants in the Siademan area. Cash-only, low-profile, the kind of places that employed people without asking for documentation. Hyun-woo had gone into 4 of them already that evening. He had eaten nothing. He had looked at every face and moved on. The 5th was a narrow place with a hand-painted sign and steam drifting out from under the kitchen door. Hyun-woo had paused outside it for a moment in a way that he hadn't paused outside the others. Not thinking. Not deciding. Just stopped, the way a compass needle stops when it finally finds north. "Here," he said. Dae-young had looked at the restaurant. It was unremarkable in every way. "You want to go in?" It wasn't a question, but Hyun-woo answered it anyway. "Yes." He pushed the door open and the warmth of the restaurant came out to meet him. The smell of broth, of dish soap, of a long evening winding down. His guards positioned themselves without being told. The few remaining diners glanced up and then looked away, the way people do when something in their instincts tells them not to make eye contact. Hyun-woo stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second. Then his body stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The way a man stops when something hits him in the chest before he has identified what it is. His eyes moved across the room with the automatic precision of a man trained to assess every space he enters. And then they found the figure at the far table, and the precision dissolved into something else entirely. The apron. The careful way of moving. The collar pulled up despite the warmth of the room. And then the figure turned, just slightly, reaching across the table, and the fluorescent light caught the unmistakable curve of a belly 8 months full of life. The bond mark on Hyun-woo's neck, cold and hollow for 8 months, flared like something coming back from the dead. Behind him, Dae-young went very still. Hyun-woo did not move, did not speak, did not breathe as far as Dae-young could tell. Across the restaurant, the tray hit the floor. The tray hit the floor, and the sound cracked through the restaurant like something had broken in the air itself. Ji-hoon did not move. His hands were empty now, both of them hanging at his sides, and his eyes were locked on the man in the doorway with the particular stillness of an animal that has just understood, fully and finally, that the thing it feared most has found it. The ceramic pieces lay scattered across the linoleum between them. Nobody in the restaurant moved to pick them up. Nobody in the restaurant moved at all. Seo Hyun-woo stood exactly where he had stopped. He was not advancing. He was not speaking. He was simply there, the way a wall is simply there, immovable, absolute, filling the space between Ji-hoon and everything beyond it. The neck tattoo was the same. The black suit was the same. The cold that arrived with him like a second presence was exactly the same. 8 months had not changed a single thing about him except, perhaps, something behind his eyes that Ji-hoon did not want to look at closely enough to name. The bond mark on Ji-hoon's neck burned. It had not done that in 8 months. It had ached hollowly, persistently, the way a wound aches when it has healed wrong. But this was different. This was heat, sudden and disorienting, spreading from the mark down his shoulder and into his chest, and his body responding to it with a recognition that had nothing to do with his mind's very clear, very urgent instructions to run. He ran. Not gracefully. There was nothing graceful left in his body at 8 months, and the stockroom door was through the kitchen, and he knew this restaurant the way he knew his own heartbeat. He turned and moved, one hand instinctively covering the side of his belly, and pushed through the kitchen door before anyone in the dining room had finished processing what was happening. Mr. Beck looked up from the sink. Ji-hoon did not stop. "Stockroom," he said, because he owed the old man that much of an explanation, and then he was through the second door and into the narrow corridor that led to the back, and he was already calculating. The stockroom locked from the inside. The small window was too high and too narrow, but if he could get in and lock the door and think for 30 seconds. The corridor was blocked. Not by a person, by a presence. Seo Hyun-woo had not come through the kitchen. He had moved around the outside of the building with a speed and a knowledge of geometry that Ji-hoon had not anticipated, and he was standing at the far end of the corridor, at the back in trance, not touching the door, not touching anything, just standing there the way he had been standing in the front of the restaurant, as if he had simply decided that this was where he would be, and the world had arranged itself accordingly. Ji-hoon stopped. The corridor was not long. There were perhaps 4 meters between them. "Ji-hoon," Hyun-woo said. Just the name. Nothing attached to it. No demand, no question, no instruction. Just the name in Hyun-woo's voice, which was lower than Ji-hoon remembered and more careful, and which did something to the burn in the bond mark that Ji-hoon absolutely refused to acknowledge. "Move," Ji-hoon said. "No. I'm asking you to move." "I know." Hyun-woo did not move. Ji-hoon's back was against the wall now. He had not realized he had stepped backward until the shelving pressed into his shoulders. His heart was going too fast. The baby, perhaps sensing the spike of adrenaline, shifted heavily against his ribs, and he pressed his palm flat against his side by reflex, and watched Hyun-woo's eyes track that movement and stay there. Something crossed the alpha's face. It was not the expression of a man asserting power. It was not the expression of a man who had found something he intended to take back by force. It was rawer than that and quieter than that, and Ji-hoon had spent 8 months teaching himself not to want things from this man, and the expression was making that very difficult. "How long?" Hyun-woo said. Still not a complete question, as if he was working toward it in stages. "That is not your concern. Ji-hoon, you don't get to say my name like that." Ji-hoon's voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. "You lost the right to say my name like that when you sent Min-jae to the lobby with an envelope." Something shifted in Hyun-woo's face. Tightened. "What did Min-jae tell you?" "Exactly what you told him to tell me." "I need you to tell me what he said." "I don't need to tell you anything." Ji-hoon straightened against the shelving, both hands now curved around his belly, which was the most honest thing he had done since the tray hit the floor, stopping pretending, for 30 seconds, that there was something here to hide. "You made your decision. I respected it. I am asking you to respect mine, and let me leave." Hyun-woo looked at him for a long moment. He had not come any closer. He had not raised his voice. He had not done any of the things a man with his resources and his reputation and his very particular skill set could have done, and Ji-hoon was aware of that in a way that made the steadiness harder to maintain. "I did not send Min-jae," Hyun-woo said. "I did not write those papers. I did not sign them." The corridor was very quiet. "They had your seal," Ji-hoon said. "I know. They had your signature." "I know." Ji-hoon stared at him. The bond mark burned. "You're lying." "I have never lied to you." Hyun-woo said it simply, without force, without the performance of sincerity that a lie requires. He said it the way he said things that he considered to be facts, briefly, directly, finished. "In 2 years, I have never lied to you. You know that." Ji-hoon knew that. He hated that he knew that. "Then what are you saying?" he said quietly. "I'm saying the papers were forged." Hyun-woo finally moved, not toward Ji-hoon, but to the side, one hand going to the inside pocket of his jacket. He withdrew nothing. He stopped, as if he had remembered, halfway through the motion, that producing anything right now would be the wrong move. "I'm saying I have spent 8 months trying to find you. I'm saying that when I find the full truth of what was done, there will be consequences for everyone involved." A pause. "But right now, in this corridor, I am only asking you for one thing." Ji-hoon waited. Hyunwoo's eyes held his. The cold that always surrounded the man had not gone, but there was something beneath it, close to the surface, that Ji-hoon recognized from the very early days, from the private hours, from the quiet after midnight when Hyunwoo stopped being Seoul's most feared anything and was simply a man who didn't entirely know what to do with being trusted. "Show me the papers," Hyunwoo said. Ji-hoon stood in the narrow corridor with his back against the shelving and both hands against his belly and the bond mark burning a hole through 8 months of careful survival, and looked at the man he had spent every day of those 8 months trying to stop loving. The baby kicked. Hard. Twice. He closed his eyes. He opened them. "They're in the stockroom," he said. "Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from." Mr. Beck, to his eternal credit, asked no questions. He looked at Hyunwoo's guards filling his kitchen doorway, looked at Ji-hoon's face, looked at the ceramic still scattered across the dining room floor, and said only, "There is a room upstairs. Clean. Private." He produced a key from his apron pocket and set it on the counter without making eye contact with anyone. And then he turned back to his sink as if the evening had proceeded entirely normally. Ji-hoon took the key because his legs had made the decision before his mind caught up with it. He told himself it was because refusing would cause a scene. He told himself it was because the dining room still had 2 tables occupied, and he owed Mr. Beck at least the dignity of moving this, whatever this was, somewhere less visible. He did not tell himself the real reason. The bond mark was still burning, and his body was still making decisions based on information his mind refused to process. And if he stood in that corridor for 1 more minute, he was going to do something that 8 months of careful survival had trained him not to do. The room upstairs was small and plainly furnished, a low table, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over the back street below. Hyunwoo's guards stayed at the door at the bottom of the stairs without being told. Dae-young, Ji-hoon noticed, positioned himself at the landing and then deliberately turned his back, which was either professionalism or mercy, and Ji-hoon didn't have the capacity to determine which. Hyunwoo sat across the low table and placed a folder on it. He did not open it. He looked at Ji-hoon first, a full, direct look, the kind that had always been difficult to sustain because it never felt like assessment, it felt like attention, which was worse. And then he said, "I need you to understand that I am not here to argue with what you experienced. I'm here to show you what was done." Ji-hoon sat with both hands in his lap. "Show me." Hyunwoo opened the folder. The documents were laid out in careful sequence. First, a forensic analysis from a third-party authentication firm. Ji-hoon didn't recognize the name, but the letterhead was formal and the date was 6 weeks ago. The conclusion was 2 paragraphs and unambiguous. The seal on the severance bond papers had been applied using a copy made from Hyunwoo's personal chop, which had been reported missing in late June and replaced in early July. The signature was a close forgery, detectable only under magnification. Ji-hoon stared at it. His hands were still in his lap. "The engagement," he said. Hyunwoo placed a second document beside the first. "Internal communications, printed and authenticated, dates running from May through July." Ji-hoon scanned them slowly. There was no engagement. There had never been an engagement. There were references to one, in messages between Min Jae and 2 other names Ji-hoon didn't recognize, framed as a plan. Something to be constructed and presented. A narrative designed to make Ji-hoon leave without a fight. The phrase used in one message was practical solution. Another message called Ji-hoon a complication. A complication. 8 months on a stockroom mattress. Scent blockers at 4 in the morning. Tips counted twice in a kitchen doorway. A complication. Ji-hoon picked up the second document. His hands were shaking. He registered this distantly, the way you register whether through glass, aware of it, separated from it, unable to do anything about it. The paper trembled in his grip, and he could not make it stop. "Min Jae," he said. "In custody. Has been for 3 weeks." Hyunwoo's voice was level, but there was something moving beneath it, controlled and contained the way water is contained. Present pressured, going nowhere it wasn't directed. The 2 men he worked with have been located. The full network of it is still being mapped. 3 weeks. Ji-hoon set the document down. "You've known for 3 weeks. I've known the shape of it for longer. The full documentation took time. You could have come sooner. I didn't know where you were." Something shifted in Hyunwoo's jaw, a tightening, brief, and telling. "I found out what was done before I found you. I have been looking for you since February." Ji-hoon looked at him across the low table. The documents lay between them like an accounting of everything that had been taken. 8 months, a bonding, a pregnancy navigated alone, a life reduced to the size of a stockroom. His hands had not stopped shaking. "I don't," he stopped. Started again. You have to understand that I watched him hand me those papers. I watched your seal on the bottom. I asked if you couldn't tell me yourself, and he said you felt it would be kinder. His voice fractured on the last word, just slightly, just at the edge. I believed him. I had no reason not to believe him. I know, Hyunwoo said quietly. I know you did. I left because I believed him. I know. The baby kicked then. Both of them felt the shift in the room before Ji-hoon's breath caught, a hard, insistent movement beneath his ribs, and his hand went to his side by instinct. He pressed his palm flat and held it there, and the kicking stilled, and the room went completely quiet. Hyunwoo had gone very still across the table. His eyes were on Ji-hoon's hand, on the place where his hand rested, and the expression on his face was one Ji-hoon had never seen on him before. It was not power. It was not control. It was not the cold precision that ran Seoul's most feared network without blinking. It was devastation. Quiet, absolute, and completely unguarded. Neither of them spoke. The backstreet was silent below the window. The documents lay on the table between them, and the baby was still, and the bond mark burned, and for a long moment neither man breathed. The medical facility did not look like a hospital from the outside. It looked like the kind of building that did not want to be looked at. Clean lines, unmarked entrance. A residential street in Yongsan that asked no questions of its neighbors and received none in return. Hyunwoo used it for his people when discretion mattered more than proximity to an emergency room. Ji-hoon understood this without being told, the way he had always understood the grammar of Hyunwoo's world. Not because he had ever been comfortable in it, but because he had paid attention. He had not agreed to come easily. He had stood in Mr. Beck's upstairs room with the documents still on the table between them and told Hyunwoo that he was not going anywhere tonight, that he had a shift in the morning, that he was fine. Hyunwoo had looked at his swollen feet and his shaking hands and the dark circles that 8 months of stockroom sleep had pressed permanently beneath his eyes, and had said nothing. He had simply waited, which had always been more effective than arguing. Ji-hoon had lasted 4 minutes of that silence before he picked up his bag. The doctor was a small, precise woman named Shin who examined Ji-hoon with the thorough efficiency of someone who had learned not to ask about the circumstances that brought patients through that particular door. She confirmed the pregnancy was 34 weeks. She confirmed the baby's position, heart rate, and development with a calm that Ji-hoon found more steadying than any reassurance would have been. She said his blood pressure was higher than she wanted it and that he needed horizontal rest and actual food, and that the stress markers in his blood work were something they would discuss at the follow-up. Ji-hoon lay in the examination room afterwards staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of Hyunwoo in the corridor. Not words, just the low register of instructions being given, and felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding everything together alone for so long that being allowed to stop feels indistinguishable from falling. He was moved to a private room. It was clean and warm, and the bed was wider than his stockroom mattress by a distance that felt almost offensive. He slept for 11 hours without meaning to. He woke to voices. Not loud, controlled, the way voices are controlled when the people using them are performing composure for an audience. A woman's voice primarily, accented with the particular precision of someone educated to speak beautifully. Ji-hoon lay still and listened to the shape of it through the closed door, and then he heard Hyunwoo's voice answer, and then he heard a name, Yoon Soo-yeon, and understood. He had heard that name once, in passing, in the documents Hyunwoo had laid out. An allied clan. A proposed arrangement. Nothing confirmed, Hyunwoo had said. Ji-hoon had believed him then. He was less certain now, listening to a voice on the other side of a hospital door that sounded very certain of its own position. The door opened. Hyunwoo entered first, which told Ji-hoon something, and the woman came in behind him, which told him more. She was exactly what Min-jae's message had implied Ji-hoon wasn't. Composed, polished, the kind of beauty that had been curated over generations of careful alliance-making. She wore a coat that cost more than 3 months of Ji-hoon's restaurant wages, and she looked at the hospital bed, and at Ji-hoon in it with an expression that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and dismissive, which was an impressive range of condescension to fit into a single look. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, in a tone that did not apologize for anything. "I simply felt it was important to address the situation directly. I understand there has been some confusion about Hyunwoo's commitments." Ji-hoon looked at her. Then he looked at Hyunwoo, who was standing very still beside the door with an expression Ji-hoon recognized as the one he wore when he was deciding the most efficient way to end something. "There is no confusion," Hyunwoo said. "Our families have been in discussion for 6 months, Soo-yeon said pleasantly. "That is not nothing. It is, in fact, nothing." Hyunwoo's voice had not changed in temperature or volume. It was simply final, the way a door being closed is final. No drama, no performance, just the sound of a thing becoming settled. The discussions were conducted without my authorization and do not reflect any commitment on my part. Suyun's composure held, but something around her eyes tightened. She turned back to Ji-hoon with the air of a woman, selecting a different approach. You seem like someone who understands how this world works, she said. Whatever he's told you tonight, whatever has been promised, I think you know the difference between what is convenient and what is permanent. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. The baby shifted against his ribs. He's right, Ji-hoon said. Hyun-woo turned to look at him. About the discussions meaning nothing, Ji-hoon continued. He kept his voice even. But she's also right that I understand how this world works. He met Suyun's eyes, which is why I'm telling him to let you have whatever was being arranged. It would be easier. For the empire. For the family structure. For everything the alliance is supposed to protect. He looked at Hyun-woo then, and it cost him more than he allowed to show. I'm not asking you to choose me. I'm telling you that you don't have to. The room was very quiet. Suyun looked between them with the careful attention of someone recalculating. Hyun-woo looked at Ji-hoon for a long moment. That full, direct attention that had always felt less like being assessed and more like being seen entirely, down to the parts that were least presentable. Then he turned to Dae-young, who had appeared at the doorway at some point during the exchange. Escort Ms. Yoon out, he said, and pull the Yoon clan contract from the conference room. All copies. Dae-young nodded once. Hyun-woo, Suyun began. The contract, Hyun-woo said, still looking at Ji-hoon, can be shredded. Suyun left the way she had arrived, composed, precise, betraying nothing, and the door closed behind her and Dae-young, and the room contracted to just the two of them, and the sound of the monitoring equipment, and the city outside the window doing what cities do, indifferently, in the middle of the night. Ji-hoon stared at the ceiling. His throat felt tight in a way he refused to indulge. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. Hyun-woo crossed to the chair beside the bed and sat down. Not looming. Not demanding. Just present. The way he had been present in the corridor. As if he had decided this was where he would be, and had no intention of being anywhere else. You said I don't have to choose you. A pause. I'm telling you the choice is already made. Ji-hoon closed his eyes. The bond mark was warm. The baby was still. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent hum. You should sleep, Hyun-woo said quietly. Ji-hoon did not answer. But he did not argue either, and after a while, in the clean, warm room that was nothing like a stockroom, with the chair beside the bed occupied for the first time in 8 months, his breathing slowly evened out. And Hyun-woo stayed exactly where he was, in the chair, through the rest of the night, because he had said the choice was already made, and he intended for Ji-hoon to wake up and find the evidence of it. 3 days into the medical facility, the nights developed their own rhythm. The day staff came and went. Dr. Shin reviewed Ji-hoon's blood work with the same quiet efficiency and made small approving sounds about his blood pressure trending downward. Dae-young appeared periodically in the doorway with updates delivered in the clipped shorthand of a man who had learned to communicate entire situations in 6 words or fewer. A rotating presence of guards occupied the corridor in shifts, professional and invisible in the way that only people trained to be invisible can manage. And Hyun-woo came in the evenings, after whatever the day had required of him, and sat in the chair beside the bed, and they talked about small things. The doctor's instructions, the baby's movements, the logistical realities of the next few weeks, and did not talk about the large things, which sat between them like furniture in a room neither of them was ready to rearrange. On the 3rd night, Hyun-woo arrived later than usual. Ji-hoon heard the shift change in the corridor, heard the particular quality of silence that meant the guards had been given distance, and then the door opened and Hyun-woo came in still wearing his jacket, which meant he had come directly from something. He sat down in the chair, and for a while neither of them spoke. The room was very quiet. The monitoring equipment made its small, steady sounds. Outside the window the city had gone to its midnight register. Not silent, never silent, but lower, more honest somehow, the way Seoul sounded when it stopped performing for the day. Ji-hoon had been carrying the question for 8 months. He had carried it through the Jimjilbang in Mapo and the 3 temporary jobs before the restaurant and the pharmacy bathroom and the stockroom mattress and all the 2 a.m. hours when the baby kicked and there was no one to tell. He had turned it over so many times it had worn smooth like river glass. And he had told himself, with the same precision he applied to the scent blockers and the tip counting and all the other mechanisms of survival, that it did not matter. That the answer either way changed nothing. That asking it was a form of wanting, and wanting was something he had given up. He asked it anyway. Did you ever look for me? Hyun-woo did not answer immediately. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the bed beside Ji-hoon's hand, a USB drive, small and unmarked. Then he leaned back in the chair and looked at the window. "Plug that into the tablet," he said. "When you're ready." Ji-hoon looked at the drive. Then he reached for the tablet on the bedside table and plugged it in and opened the single folder it contained. The files were dated. That was the first thing he registered. Every file dated, running in sequence from the 3rd week of August, 3 weeks after the night in the lobby, continuous through to the present. Hundreds of them. Search logs. Private investigator reports from 7 different firms, none of them connected to each other, all of them running parallel searches. Photographs of neighborhoods. Lists of jjimjilbangs, convenience stores, clinics, restaurants. CCTV stills, blurred and inconclusive, pulled from city infrastructure through channels Ji-hoon did not want to think too hard about. A document from November that was simply a list of every cash-only employer registered in 4 different districts, annotated by hand in Hyun-woo's writing. By hand. Hyun-woo's writing in the margins on a list of restaurants. Ji-hoon scrolled slowly. His throat had closed in a way that made breathing a conscious effort. The files kept going, December, January, February, the pace of them increasing as the investigation into Min-jae produced new leads and new directions. A map with search radiuses marked in expanding circles from Ji-hoon's last confirmed location, each circle dated, the circles growing wider month by month until they covered most of the city. He reached the last file. It was dated 2 weeks ago. It was the restaurant, an external photograph taken from the street, the hand-painted sign visible above the door. Annotated in 2 words, possible match. Ji-hoon set the tablet down. He did not trust his voice, so he said nothing, and Hyun-woo did not fill the silence, which had always been one of the things about him that Ji-hoon had found most difficult to defend against. The willingness to let silence be silence, to not perform into it. "You looked for me the whole time," Ji-hoon said finally. "Yes. 8 months. Yes." Ji-hoon looked at his hands in his lap. They were not shaking now. They were very still, which somehow felt worse. "I thought," he stopped. The thing he had thought for 8 months was too large and too humiliating to say directly. He tried the edge of it. "I thought I was a complication you were relieved to have resolved." "I know what you thought." Hyun-woo's voice was quiet. "Min-jae was very good at his job. He knew exactly what would make you believe it. He knew I would leave without a fight. He knew you would protect me even from yourself." A pause. He was right about that part. He was always right about that part. Ji-hoon pressed his lips together. The baby moved, a slow rolling shift rather than a kick, as if it too had arrived at something and was settling. "I'm sorry," Ji-hoon said. "For disappearing. For not," he stopped again. "I should have found a way to confirm it directly. You were given no reason to doubt it and every reason to believe it." Hyun-woo leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, hands loosely linked. "Not reaching. Just closer. Don't apologize for surviving what was done to you." Ji-hoon looked at him across the small distance between the chair and the bed. The city hummed its midnight honesty outside the window. The USB drive sat on the blanket beside his hand. 8 months of looking made small and solid and irrefutable. "Okay," Ji-hoon said softly. It was not forgiveness, and it was not resolution, and it was not the end of the distance between them. But it was the first thing he had said in 8 months that was not built around leaving, and Hyun-woo received it the way he received everything. Quietly, completely, without wasting it. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The summons arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a man Ji-hoon had never seen before. Older, gray-suited, carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in proximity to power and absorbed its habits. He handed Dae-young an envelope at the facility entrance, and left without speaking. Dae-young brought it to Hyun-woo. Hyun-woo read it and set it on the table with the careful placement of a man deciding how to handle something volatile. "My father," he said, "wants to meet." Ji-hoon had been expecting it in the abstract way that you expect weather. Knowing it is coming, unable to determine exactly when, not entirely prepared when it arrives. He looked at the envelope and then at Hyun-woo's face, which was giving him the controlled version, the one that ran Seoul's underworld without blinking. "Both of us," Ji-hoon said. "Yes. He could have just summoned you. He could have." Hyun-woo picked up the envelope and folded it once, precisely, in half. He didn't. They went on Thursday. Ji-hoon wore his own clothes, the cleanest things from his single bag, which fell considerably short of the occasion, and which he decided, somewhere between the facility and the CO family headquarters in Gangnam, that he was not going to apologize for. He had spent 8 months apologizing for his existence in various implicit and explicit ways, and he had quietly decided somewhere around the fourth day in the medical facility, finished with that. The headquarters building was everything the restaurant was not: cold marble, high ceilings, the kind of silence that has been architecturally engineered. Hyunwoo walked beside him through the lobby, and Ji-hoon was aware, without it being said, that the positioning was deliberate. Not in front, not behind, beside. Seo Changwon was waiting for them in a room on the 14th floor that was furnished like a courtroom and felt like one. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with Hyunwoo's bone structure and none of Hyunwoo's occasional, carefully rationed warmth. He looked at his son first, and then at Ji-hoon with the thorough, dispassionate attention of a man appraising an asset that had complicated his portfolio. He did not offer them tea. He gestured to the chairs across the table and waited until they were seated, and then he opened a folder of his own. Because apparently the Seo family conducted every significant conversation across a table with a folder, which Ji-hoon might have found almost funny under different circumstances. "I'll be direct," Changwon said. "I have always found directness more efficient than performance." "Then we agree on something," Ji-hoon said. A pause. Changwon looked at him with an expression that recalibrated slightly. Not warmth, not approval, but a minimal upward revision of whatever category he had placed Ji-hoon in. "The situation as it stands," Changwon continued, "is untenable. My son's bond with an unregistered Omega, a pregnancy undisclosed for 8 months, the internal security failure that precipitated it. These are not private matters. They have structural implications for every alliance this family holds." He folded his hands on the table. "I am not here to assign blame. I am here to propose a resolution that protects everyone involved." He slid a document across the table toward Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon looked at it without touching it. It was longer than the forged severance papers had been, and considerably more detailed. A property in Jeju, oceanfront, the summary indicated. A monthly settlement figure that was larger than anything Ji-hoon had earned in the previous 2 years combined. Full medical coverage. Educational provisions for the child. In exchange, relocation within 60 days of the birth. No further contact with Hyunwoo or the Seo family structure. The child to be registered under Seo family records and raised within the network, with visitation terms to be determined at a later date by family council. Ji-hoon read it to the end. Then he placed both hands flat on the table and looked at Seo Changwon. "No," he said. Changwon studied him. "You haven't considered the full." "I've read it completely," Ji-hoon said. "The answer is no. The settlement is generous. The property alone. I understand what's being offered." Ji-hoon kept his voice level. 8 months of stockroom mornings had given him a particular relationship with composure. Not the performed composure of the powerful, but the functional composure of someone who has learned that falling apart is a luxury that costs too much. "And I understand what's being asked for in return. You want me to give my child to a family structure and disappear from their life so that the heir arrives with a clean origin story. You're offering me comfort in exchange for erasure." He paused. "I've already been erased once by this family. I'm not doing it again." The room was very quiet. Changwon leaned back slightly. Something moved in his expression. Not anger, not exactly. A reassessment. "You understand that refusing complicates your position considerably," he said. "You have no legal standing in this structure. No registration. No recognized bond. Whatever my son has said to you in private, the family council." "The bond mark is real," Ji-hoon said. "It's been real for 2 years. Forged papers don't unsever a bond, which I think you know, or you wouldn't need a settlement agreement. You'd just wait for it to dissolve." He kept his eyes on Changwon's face. "It hasn't dissolved. In 8 months, it hasn't dissolved." Beside him, Hyunwoo had not spoken. Ji-hoon had asked him, in the car on the way, to let him handle the first part of this, and Hyunwoo had agreed in the way he agreed to things that cost him. Completely, without conditions, and with the stillness of someone holding something carefully. Changwon looked at his son now. "You intend to allow this?" "I intend to support it," Hyunwoo said. "The council will not accept an unregistered bond as legitimate grounds." "Then I'll register it," Hyunwoo said. "Formally. Before the council, before the allied clans, before whoever else requires a witness. This week if necessary. You would destabilize 3 active alliances. I would clarify them." Hyunwoo's voice had not risen. It never rose. It simply became more precise, which was its own kind of pressure. "Every alliance we hold is built on the premise that my commitments are reliable. Abandoning a legitimate bond and a registered heir to satisfy a political arrangement would demonstrate exactly the opposite." He looked at his father without flinching. I am not asking for approval. I am telling you what is going to happen so that you have time to prepare for it. Changwon was silent for a long moment. He looked at the document still lying on the table in front of Ji-hoon, unsigned. He looked at his son. He looked at Ji-hoon with the long, measuring attention of a man who has run a criminal empire for 30 years and knows the difference between a person who can be moved and a person who cannot. Ji-hoon looked back at him steadily, both hands flat on the table. 36 weeks pregnant and dressed in the cleanest things from a single bag, and did not look away. Changwon closed his folder. He did not speak again immediately. When he did, it was not to Ji-hoon, and it was not about the settlement. The registration, he said to Hyun-woo, will need to be handled correctly. The timing matters. Hyun-woo said, I know. I will need 3 days to manage the Yoon and Park clan responses before any public announcement. 3 days, Hyun-woo said. Agreed. Ji-hoon looked at the older man across the table and understood that this was not acceptance. Not yet, perhaps not for a long time. It was a patriarch calculating the most structurally sound way to absorb a reality he could not eliminate. It was not warmth, but it was, in the cold grammar of this world, something. He picked up the settlement document from the table and folded it once, the same way Hyun-woo had folded the summons, and placed it back in front of Changwon without a word. On the way out, in the elevator, Hyun-woo looked at him. You told me to let you handle the first part, he said. You did, Ji-hoon said. Are you all right? Ji-hoon considered the question honestly. His back ached. The baby was pressing against his ribs with the determined persistence of someone who had run out of room. His hands, he noticed, were completely steady. Yes, he said, and meant it. The gathering was called for a Friday evening, which Dae-young noted was unusual. Clan meetings were traditionally held on neutral weekday afternoons, a convention that communicated routine and discouraged drama. A Friday evening communicated something different. It communicated that what was about to happen was not routine, and that the host was not concerned about whether it produced drama or not. Hyun-woo had spent the 3 days following the meeting with his father in a state of contained, methodical preparation that Ji-hoon recognized from the early months of their bond. The particular quality of focus that meant the boss had made a decision and was now simply executing it, and that the distance between the decision and its completion was merely logistical. Dae-young moved through the facility with the efficiency of a man who understood the assignment completely. Clan representatives were contacted. Attendance was communicated rather than requested, which was its own kind of message. On Thursday evening, Hyun-woo came to the room and sat in the chair and said, You don't have to stand beside me. You can be present without being visible. Ji-hoon had thought about this. He had thought about it for most of the previous 2 days, in the honest hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when the baby was restless and the room was quiet and there was nothing to do but think clearly. What would you do, Ji-hoon said, if I told you to go in there alone and make the announcement and leave me out of it entirely? Hyun-woo looked at him. I would do it. I know. Ji-hoon shifted against the pillows and pressed his palm briefly against the side of his belly. A gesture that had become reflexive in the past weeks, a constant small conversation. That's why I'm not telling you that. He looked at Hyun-woo steadily. I'll stand beside you. The bond mark, Hyun-woo said carefully. Ji-hoon had kept the collar up since the night in the restaurant corridor. Reflex and 8 months of survival habit. I know, he said. I won't ask you to. I know, Ji-hoon said again. I'll decide in the morning. He decided in the morning. He dressed in the clothes Hyun-woo had arranged, simple, dark, well-fitted. Chosen by someone who had understood without being told that Ji-hoon would not want to look like he was trying to compete in a room full of people who had spent their lives competing. He stood in front of the mirror and looked at the collar of the shirt, and then he folded it down and looked at the bond mark on the left side of his neck, faded from the months of suppression drugs but present, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. He left the collar down. The CO headquarters conference room on the 14th floor had been rearranged for the gathering. The standard working table replaced by a configuration that placed Hyun-woo at a clear head position with the assembled clan representatives arranged in a loose arc before him. Ji-hoon counted 11 representatives as they entered, some of whom he recognized by reputation, none of whom he had met. They were uniformly well-dressed, uniformly composed, and uniformly doing the thing that powerful people do when something surprises them, absorbing it without showing that they are absorbing it. Ji-hoon walked in beside Hyun-woo. He did not walk behind him. He did not walk ahead. He walked beside him, at the same pace, and felt the shift in the room's attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatic, not loud, simply present and undeniable. Co Changwon was seated at the far right of the arc. He did not look at Ji-hoon when they entered. He looked at his son. Hyunwoo did not sit. He stood at the head of the configuration with the easy authority of a man who had never needed furniture to establish his position in a room, and he waited until the residual movement settled into complete stillness, and then he spoke. I called this gathering to make 2 registrations, both of which will be formally documented and distributed to all parties present by end of business today. He did not preamble. He did not frame or soften. The first is the registration of my bond with Lee Ji-hoon, Omega, as a legitimate and primary bond under CO family records. The bond has been active for 2 years. The severance documentation filed 8 months ago was forged without my knowledge or authorization. The individuals responsible are in custody, and the matter is being resolved through internal process. A pause, brief and complete. The bond stands. The room received this in silence. Ji-hoon stood beside Hyunwoo and looked at a point on the far wall, and kept his breathing even and his hands still. The second registration, Hyunwoo continued, is the formal recognition of our unborn child as my sole legitimate heir. All succession documentation will be updated accordingly. All alliance terms contingent on alternative succession arrangements are hereby nullified, effective today, and my office will contact affected parties individually to renegotiate terms on the current footing. A representative on the left side of the arc, older man, the Kwon clan, Ji-hoon recalled from the documents, shifted in his seat. The timeline of the pregnancy raises questions about. The timeline, Hyunwoo said without looking at him, is consistent with the bond. If documentation is required, Dr. Shin's office will provide it. The quiet in his voice was absolute. Are there other questions about timeline, or can we proceed? There were no other questions about timeline. Ji-hoon felt rather than saw the attention of the room moving across him with the systematic thoroughness of people recalculating positions. He had spent 8 months being invisible, and he stood in the visibility of this room and held himself steady, and the bond mark on his neck was warm, and the baby pressed against his ribs with the particular insistence of someone who had somewhere to be, and he thought, with a clarity that felt like arriving somewhere after a very long walk, that he was finished being a complication, that he had never actually been a complication, that the people who had called him one had been afraid of exactly this, the specific, irreducible fact of him standing in a room like this one, collar down, and not leaving. Hyunwoo turned his head slightly and looked at Ji-hoon, and something passed between them that required no translation. Then Hyunwoo looked at his father. Seo Changwon had not moved throughout the proceedings. He sat with the stillness of a man who had learned over decades to make stillness communicate whatever he needed it to communicate, and his expression had not changed in any way that was legible to anyone in the room except, perhaps, his son. The silence between them lasted long enough to be felt by everyone present. The assembled clan representatives did not look away. Dae-young, standing at the room's perimeter, was very still. Changwon looked at his son. He looked briefly at Ji-hoon. He looked back at Hyunwoo. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. The minimal movement of a man giving the maximum thing he was capable of giving, in the only language he had ever learned to use. It was not warmth. It would perhaps never be warmth. But it was the thing that mattered in this room, in this world, with these people watching. It was public, and it was unambiguous, and it could not be walked back. Hyunwoo received it without expression. But something in his shoulders changed. A release so small that Ji-hoon might have missed it if he hadn't spent 2 years learning the difference between Hyunwoo performing calm and Hyunwoo actually finding it. The formal documentation took 40 minutes. Representatives filed out in the efficient way of people who had other arrangements to reconsider. Dae-young managed the room's dissolution with his usual invisible competence. When the last person had gone, Ji-hoon stood in the emptied room and let out a breath that had been building since Thursday morning. Hyunwoo came to stand beside him, and they looked at the city through the 14th floor window together, and for a while neither of them needed to say anything at all. Your feet, Hyunwoo said finally. Ji-hoon looked down. He had been standing for 2 hours. His feet were making their position known with considerable clarity. Yes, he admitted. Hyunwoo said nothing further. He simply moved toward the door, and Ji-hoon followed, and the 14th floor returned to its engineered silence behind them, holding the shape of what had just been made permanent inside its cold marble walls. The labor started at 4 in the morning, which Ji-hoon would later think was entirely characteristic. His son had spent 9 months making his presence known at inconvenient hours, and he arrived the same way. Ji-hoon woke to a tightening that was categorically different from the Braxton Hicks contractions Dr. Shin had described at the last appointment. He lay still for 60 seconds and timed it, and then sat up and reached for his phone with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment and was not going to waste energy on panic before it was warranted. He called Hyun-woo. It rang twice. Ji-hoon. It's time, Ji-hoon said. Don't speed. There was a pause. I'm already in the car. I said don't speed. I heard you. He sped. Ji-hoon knew because the distance between the CO residence and the medical facility was 23 minutes at legal hours and Hyun-woo was through the door in 14, still buttoning his jacket, which was the most undone Ji-hoon had ever seen him look, and which under the circumstances he found more steadying than any amount of visible composure would have been. Dr. Shin was already there. The facility's overnight staff moved with the organized efficiency of people who had been briefed and prepared and were now simply executing. And Ji-hoon was moved and monitored and positioned with a thoroughness that left very little room for fear to find a foothold. He focused on the room, the equipment, Dr. Shin's voice giving him information in the clear, direct way he had come to rely on. The contractions arriving and receding like weather, each one something to be moved through rather than resisted. Hyun-woo sat beside him and did not speak unless spoken to, which was the right thing, and held Ji-hoon's hand with a grip that was carefully calibrated, present and firm without being desperate. Which was also the right thing, and Ji-hoon thought somewhere in the third hour, through the specific focused haze of active labor, that this was who Hyun-woo was when the performance was completely gone. Just a man in a chair holding on, because it was the only useful thing available to him, and he had decided to do it completely. The 7th hour was the hardest. Ji-hoon stopped being able to think in sentences, and existed instead in the immediate, consuming physicality of a body, doing something enormous. He heard Dr. Shin's voice as a series of instructions, and he followed them because following instructions was the architecture his survival had been built on for 8 months, and the habit held even here, even now. Hyun-woo said his name once, quietly, during the worst of it. Not a question, not an instruction, just his name in that careful voice which meant, I am here, I am not leaving, you are not doing this alone. Ji-hoon held on. At 11:17 in the morning, CO Jian arrived. The cry was immediate and furious and entirely disproportionate to the size of the person producing it. A declaration, a complaint, an announcement that something had arrived that intended to be heard. The room shifted into its post-arrival rhythm, Dr. Shin and her staff moving with swift, gentle efficiency, and Ji-hoon heard the cry and felt something in his chest that had been clenched for 8 months simply open. He turned his head to find Hyun-woo. Hyun-woo was white. Not pale, white in the specific way of a man whose body has outrun his ability to manage its responses. He was standing, which Ji-hoon did not remember him doing, and he was looking at the bundle in Dr. Shin's hands with an expression that had nothing in it of souls most feared anything. It had in it only the completely undefended face of a person encountering something that has permanently rearranged them, and having no mechanism prepared for it, because no mechanism exists for this, for the specific moment when something you have been protecting in the abstract becomes suddenly, irrevocably, loudly real. Hyun-woo, Ji-hoon said. His voice came out rough and exhausted and entirely fond. Hyun-woo looked at him. The white had not left his face. Sit down, Ji-hoon said gently, before you fall down. He sat. Dr. Shin placed the baby in Ji-hoon's arms with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times and understood that the first moment belonged to the person who had done the work. Ji-hoon looked down at his son, at the screwed-up, outraged, perfect face, the extraordinary smallness of him, the dark hair, the hands already curled into positions of opinion, and the 8 months and the stockroom and the scent blockers and the tip counting and all the long hours of surviving alone telescoped into this single point of arrival and meant nothing. Were worth it, were the price of this exact moment, and he would have paid it again. Hello, Ji-hoon said softly. We've met. I've been waiting to see your face. Jian, deeply unimpressed by everything so far, continued to express his feelings about the situation at volume. Hyun-woo, beside the bed, had recovered his color in the incremental way of a man reassembling himself piece by piece. He looked at the baby with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered most, not the broad surveillance of a man managing a room, but the narrow, complete attention of a man who has found the only thing in it that counts. Can I? He started. Yes, Ji-hoon said before he finished. Dr. Shin guided the transfer with professional calm. Hyun-woo received his son with both hands, and the exaggerated care of someone handling something that has no equivalent and must not be dropped, and Jian, perhaps sensing a change in atmosphere, reduced his volume from furious declaration to a lower, more investigative register. Hyun-woo sat on the floor beside the bed. Not in the chair. The floor, because the chair was too far, Ji-hoon understood, and distance was not something Hyun-woo was willing to negotiate right now. He sat with his back against the bed frame and his son against his chest and looked down at the face of the person who had rearranged him. And Ji-hoon watched from above, as the last of souls most feared anything dissolved completely and left behind only a father on a hospital floor, holding a baby the size of his forearm, undone in the best possible way. He did not cry loudly. It was quieter than that, a single exhale that shook slightly, and a stillness afterward that was entirely different from all his other stillnesses. Ji-hoon reached down and put his hand briefly on Hyun-woo's shoulder and left it there, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. 3 months later, Ji-hoon stood in the doorway of the room that had been made into a nursery in the CO residence and watched Hyun-woo walk the length of it with Jian against his chest. The baby was asleep, had been asleep for 20 minutes, and Hyun-woo was still walking, slowly, one hand spread across the small back, because Jian had fallen asleep while being walked and Hyun-woo had apparently decided that stopping was a risk he was unwilling to take. The empire had been renegotiated. 3 alliances restructured, 2 strengthened by the clarity of the declaration, 1 dissolved and replaced within a month by a better arrangement that Chong-won had, with characteristic efficiency, identified and pursued once he had accepted the new footing. Dae-young ran the day-to-day with the competence of a man who had been functionally running it for 8 months anyway. Hyun-woo was present and decisive, and no longer dismantling things in the middle of the night. The bond mark was warm, had been warm continuously since the night the tray hit the floor. Ji-hoon leaned against the doorframe and watched his son sleep in his father's arms. The small face slack and trusting, the large hands impossibly gentle, and felt the last of the 8 months leave his body on a single quiet breath. He had spent so long surviving that he had forgotten this was also possible. This ordinary, extraordinary thing. A warm room, a sleeping child, a man who had torn the city apart looking for him, walking slow circles in a nursery at 11 in the evening because the baby was finally asleep and he didn't want to stop. Hyun-woo looked up and found him in the doorway. Ji-hoon smiled. Small, real, the kind that had nothing to perform and nowhere to hide. Hyun-woo held his gaze for a moment with the full, direct attention that had always felt like being seen entirely. And then he looked back down at their son, and his mouth curved and Ji-hoon exhaled, and outside soul did what it always did, indifferently, beautifully, in the dark.